So you've talked about, when we've shared before this today, about your belief in conversation as being a very strong theme in the way in which you've conducted various roles, as you'll see from the biography, in so many different places, and those will emerge as we talk. And I believe that your passion for conversation and sharing is going to inform the way you're going to approach the vice presidency. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. This morning, I think we started off with David telling us about stories. Actually, exchanging stories is another form of conversation, or it is a form of conversation. So, and where the world has completely gone wrong in so many ways, history tells us that where there is no conversation, humanity gets itself into trouble. And so it is natural that we engage in conversation. Conversation actually allows us to understand each other, to make friends, and it allows us to form a bond. So and if you can imagine a world, your world, without conversation, that's not you can't contemplate the idea that we will not have conversation. And for me, conversation allows me to learn and share. And without learning and sharing, again, it's not a life that you can have. And of course, those of you who know me, my conversation, I prefer conversation with food. Because, well, there you go. Because food is something that, you know, when you're sitting around the table and sharing, the conversation, it makes it so much easier, and it gives you a different level of relationship. You're sharing the food, you're breaking the bread together, and that makes conversation even more meaningful.
Thank you. So how will this feature in your vice presidency, and what is it that you're hoping to achieve through it? What battles are you seeking to fight? I think that sounds a fairly strong way of putting it. But
well, I think we are always having battles, aren't we? Everybody has a battle almost every day, and when you have a conversation, in many ways, you're selling your ideas. You're saying to someone, hey, this is what I want to do, or the stories that we hear. It's a sales pitch. It is actually a sales pitch. And you don't have to sell the retail stuff. You are selling ideas. And you're trying to persuade people to go along with you or change their attitude. So what I would do with conversation, let me give you an example. Last week, I was in Jordan, and I sat on the bed with this woman, Iraqi woman, and she was telling me the story, her story, of how she found herself in Jordan. And I learned immediately, as if I didn't already know, that each one of us had a part in her displacement from her home, because we allowed our government to invade that country. And the consequences of that were sat next to me, and it took all my courage not to burst down and get into tears. That conversation is going to stay with me for the rest of my life. And every time I get an opportunity, I'm going to sell that story so that we'll never forget some of the things that we have done and our responsibility to put things right. That is the story. I'm selling that concept to you, and that's what I hope to do in the year that as I'm vice president. But it goes beyond that. We are doing it before that, and I'm sure I'll be doing it beyond.
Now, you've got some images with you, which I asked Bala whether he too would bring some visual representation of things that have been seminal or influenced him.
This is Kranti, and she's another woman who reduced me to tears. And I'll tell you what, I hope you'll get it when I've finished telling the story. I met her in India, in Madhya Pradesh. I was on a Christian Aid visit, and Kranti was born into a family of manual scavengers. Do we know what that is? Okay, so it's a dehumanizing job. Most of them, it is illegal, but they're forced into that work by the system, and also because one has to earn a living and put bread on the table. But Kranti rebelled, and she went off and got herself educated. And she's a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. What she does is, so before I get to that, I need to tell you a little bit about the Dalits, because she's from the Dalit community. Now, Dalits for centuries in India have been oppressed, and terrible human rights abuses have been perpetrated on the Dalit community. And so she's from the Dalit community, and within the Dalit community, she was from the scavenging, the manual scavengers. And the atrocities are perpetrated mainly by men, almost exclusively by men. And there is very little recourse to get these people to justice. What Kranti does with her colleagues is encourages the victims to stand up and take the perpetrator to court. Now, the Indian legal system works provided you can use it with confidence, not something that the marginalized communities like the Dalits naturally have. So her job is to go around persuading the victims to come forward and then collect the evidence, train the victim and the witnesses. So in their office, there is a mock court, and the victims and the witnesses are put through their paces to make sure that the defense lawyer doesn't trip them up. So this is the work that she does. And, you know, we talked about leadership. I don't think you need me to explain what type of leadership that is. And then I said to her, hey, why are you doing this? You don't need to do this. She said to me, I'm doing this because I'm a woman, because I'm educated, and because I'm a Dalit. And I was so inspired and humbled by this 30-something woman, half my age, doing so much in a situation where I don't know how I would have survived. So that is leadership, I think. And I don't know which category you will put Kranti in, but I don't think you need to categorize Kranti's work.
If we can bring it back to the UK and the churches here, it's probably a difficult question, I suppose, but how do you think, what do you want to see in the churches here, in the Methodist churches, that actually will impinge on the way in which others are able to live their lives, those who are marginalised, those who don't have a voice, those without, because I think this is a passion of yours?
Well, I think it is our divine responsibility, and I borrowed that phrase from Imam that I met in Nigeria, but if you get the time, I will tell you that story too. But it is our responsibility to confront injustice. That is our call. And if we don't confront injustice, then we are not the Church of Jesus Christ. And if we are not the Church of Jesus Christ, we have no right to preach the gospel and the good news story. That defines us. So I want to persuade my friends and colleagues, and I hope they will be still friends when I finish, that it is our responsibility to confront injustice. Now, injustice, of course, comes in so many different ways, and in Britain, the one that is stark, for me anyway, is poverty. And our response to poverty. And the excuses we make for putting up with poverty. A few years ago, you've all probably heard of the Joint Public Issues team put out a document on the myths or the lies we tell ourselves about poverty. And there was a couple of my friends who did a video clip on that, on our understanding or what we say to ourselves about poor people, and therefore have an excuse for not actually doing anything about it. I think their Methodist tradition has enabled them to, quite a humorous way, but something that you will remember, how to get across this myth that poor people are idle and are out of work. The point about showing that video was we have a responsibility as a church to confront this type of nonsense. The working poor, sadly, is a fact of life. And those who turn up in food banks and all sorts of areas where they need our help, generally, and particularly as the church, then we have a responsibility to blow the myths that we have seen. And the tragedy, by the way, in some of the surveys that was done recently or a few years ago, general public, including churchgoers, believe this stuff.
So how can we go about doing that?
Well, conversation. I think we go back to conversation. Now, I don't know how many of you believed this stuff before you arrived here. Hopefully when you leave here, you would have been convinced, actually, that's not the case. Just to reinforce that, I'm a trustee of Methodist Homes, and part of being a trustee is that I'm part of a group of people who operate the Hardship Fund. And the Hardship Fund is for people who work in Methodist Homes. Incidentally, Methodist Homes is the only care system or care home system that pay higher than the national, than the real living wage. So in spite of that, we have a hardship fund. And you would be surprised at the type of applications we get. Have to go for a funeral. It's not something that you and I even think about. All the wheels fall off with a simple or a small incident that doesn't cost £300-400. So, and these are people who work every shift possible. So the reality of the working poor is in front of us. And I think, at the risk of repeating myself, if we don't confront it and challenge it, then we are not the Church of Jesus. I firmly believe that. And again, at the risk of repeating it, if we are not the Church of Jesus Christ, then we absolutely have no right to preach anything.
Thank you for that, because we started with a question, didn't we, right at the beginning of the conference, and it's on the flyer, well, what does leading enable? So really you're leading us towards an intention for leadership. And you just gave us some examples of people leading and taking responsibility and changing things. So this is where we're going with this conversation, that leading can enable us to challenge these things and to address them. And I think there's an awful lot more we could say, but I'm going to give you a few minutes to just say, is there something you'd like to say to this group gathered here before you take up your vice presidency in a couple of weeks' time that people can take away and follow your vice presidency? Because, of course, you will, throughout, do you actually publish?
Blogging is not my scene, but I think I'll have to do that. I don't know what I can say to you, apart from what I've already said. As I travel around the country, I want to engage with people who are like-minded, who are also confronting the injustices in this world. Whether they are in church or whether they are not in church. How can we work together to make a difference? It's not, it's a hard slog. You need to build it up and make, given that we are not into revolution, we have to make small but definite steps. And some of it is about educating good people who just don't recognize it, I think. I don't know how many of you had seen these myths before. And are you thinking differently now? So I don't know whether that's a reasonable answer or even a straightforward answer to your question. But what I'm going to say is, it's not just me, but every one of you has a responsibility to confront injustice and work with those who are able to fight this injustice and make a difference.
Thank you for that. So you're saying it's a collective endeavour, but you in your vice presidency will be raising this as something which we really need to address, which I guess goes back to our point that, it's not church isn't just for us, it's about achieving something through our faith. Well, thank you very much. If there's anything else you want to say towards the end of the conference when we have this gathering everything together, but we really do appreciate you coming here. And we pray for a great blessing on your vice presidency, which you begin very soon, and we shall look on with interest. Well, and maybe you'll visit some of us. So thank you very much, Bala.